Thanks, Chair. Last estimates, I asked some questions about NLAP. We just had the Monday review handed down a few days before, and a series of questions I put on notice asking for some detailed breakdown of where the government's funding allocations would be delivered. And Secretary, none of the questions were answered in substance. There was no detail of where the Commonwealth's funding would go, no detail of which services would get funded, no detail of how much would go to legal aid commissions or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services. No detail at all was given. I can't tell you how frustrating that has been for the sector to not know where the money's going, but it's also not responding to perfectly reasonable requests in estimates about where some, I think, $500 million of additional money to frontline sectors over 5 years is intended to go. Are you in a position to tell the sector where this additional $500 million will go over the next 5 years?
Senator, I'll ask Ms Harvey, and in terms of she'll explain in terms of the timing of the answers for the questions on notice, as well as what we can provide now.
Senator, the National Access to Justice Partnership is still being negotiated with the states and the territories, and so part of that negotiation is, of course, around the funding, and so we are continuing to work with the states and territories to finalise the agreement. We're very conscious of the desire of the sector to know when the funding that will be provided, and so the heads of agreement that were agreed by the National Cabinet on the 6th of September commit to the final details to be settled and signed by Attorneys General by the end of November 2024, and also the states agreed to provide funding certainty to providers within their jurisdiction in terms of the 25-26 financial year. So that breakdown is still being finalised.
So have the states and the Commonwealth agreed to a hard deadline at the end of November?
So the heads
the
heads of agreement that were agreed as part of the National Cabinet indicate that Attorneys General will settle by the end of November.
One of the questions that I asked was, will there be a full government response issued to the 39 recommendations of the independent review of the National Legal Assistance Partnership, and if so, when will that be? I'll read you the answer. The purpose of Dr Warren Mundy's independent review of the National Legal Assistance Partnership is to inform the negotiations and development of legal assistance funding arrangements under the new National Access to Justice Partnership following the expiry of the current National Legal Assistance Partnership on 30 June 2025. I've read that twice this morning before I came in here. I'm still yet to see how it answers my question. So I'm going to ask the question again. Will there be a full government response issued to the 39 recommendations in the independent review of the National Legal Assistance Partnership, and if so, when will that be?
Senator, I think, sorry, I'm just looking at these parliamentary questions on notice. The answer that was provided is correct in that
it might be correct, but it's answering a different question.
Well, Dr Mundy's review was undertaken as part of the National Legal Assistance Partnership it was incorporated in the partnership itself that there would be this review that would then inform the next one. It wasn't undertaken as a review that would then be responded to in a formal, recommendation by recommendation way by governments.
So if I'm to read this in light of what you've just said, the answer is no. There won't be a response to the 39 recommendations set out in the Mundy review. If I'm reading between the lines, the answer is no. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes, Senator.
Why didn't you say that? If the answer is no, why do we instead get some oblique non-answer as the answer? I know it might be awkward to say that the government won't respond to Dr Mundy's 39 recommendations, but it's not an appropriate response to deflect and not answer it.
Senator, I think the response goes to explaining the use of the report by Dr Mundy.
My question was, will the government be responding to the 39 recommendations? And no matter how many times you read it, the answer there is no answer to that. You get an oblique reference that Dr Mundy's report is going to be used to inform negotiations. Dr Mundy made 39 carefully calibrated recommendations after hearing from the sector, and the sector, which is in an incredibly resource-scarce environment, delivered substantial parts of their resources to inform Dr Mundy and to get those recommendations. And then we find out now, a year and a bit after more than that, 18 months after the review commenced, that the government won't even have the decency of responding to Dr Mundy's recommendations. That is a slap in the face to the sector, and it makes you question what was the purpose of an independent review that the government isn't responding to.
Senator, reviews like this are regularly done. They don't necessarily result in a formal government response, but they are used to inform the policy and policy work of engaging with the states and the territories and in terms of the development of the new agreement.
But the terms of reference for Dr Mundy's review were not just about the new agreement. It was to do a review of the funding adequacy and the needs for the sector. The terms of reference weren't narrowed down to the agreement. It appears that what the government has now decided to do is that many of those recommendations are awkward and expensive, and rather than address the recommendations, you'll just say, well, we're only using it for this very narrow purpose, only for the purpose of the next funding round.
Senator, the context of the review by Dr Mundy was the National Legal Assistance Partnership. I can't remember the provision, but it is provided for in the NLAP itself, similar to the reviews that were done following the National Partnership Agreement. It was to inform what happens next. Yes, it was a broad review. My colleague Ms Bogart might be able to talk a little bit more about how we have the review has informed what is going into the NAJP, but it did come out. The context of it was coming out of the NLAP.
Yeah, we could spend the next 10 minutes reading on the extremely lengthy terms of reference for the Mundy review. It was in the context of NLAP, but by no means was it limited to NLAP. It was looking at, to quote it, a holistic assessment of legal need and all Commonwealth legal assistance funding, including, and then there's a list, the effectiveness and challenges of delivering core legal assistance services and what funding is needed to address that, cultural appropriateness of legal assistance services, issues about gender services, the adequacy of services to actually implement the national plan to end violence against women and children. That's what the 39 recommendations are directed to, and the government is choosing to ignore them.
I don't think that's accurate, Senator Shoebridge. As you're probably aware, the review was commissioned either because of or in line with the existing provisions of the NLAP, and the NLAP itself has noted that future arrangements will take into account the recommendations of the review. In addition, the government has already provided an $800 million increase on current funding levels for the legal assistance sector, which means it's the biggest Commonwealth investment in legal assistance ever. It's going to go a long way towards addressing some of the issues you raised around the pay rates and pay parity for the Community Legal Centre, for women's legal services, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services, and the recommendations of the review will be considered as future arrangements are prepared. But you can't just airbrush the fact there's been a massive new investment in community legal centres under this government.
Well, how much has been invested? What's the additional funding for community legal centres? So you say I can't. I can't ignore that.
So there's the new agreement is $3.9 billion, including an $800 million increase on current funding levels for the legal assistance sector, plus a commitment to ongoing funding.
Minister, you said I can't ignore how much has been delivered, additional funding for community legal centres. So now I'm going to ask the department to tell me how much of additional funding is going to community legal centres, the figure that I can't ignore. How much?
So, Senator, as I mentioned at the start, so we are still negotiating the National Access to Justice Partnership. The roughly $800 million that Minister Watt referred to has a couple of different components. Some of that goes towards pay parity, some of that goes towards better indexation. The pay parity, for example, is targeted towards a number of parts of the sector, so community legal centres being one of them, to be able to have go towards pay parity as against legal aid commissions. But the precise breakdown of those figures is still being finalised through these negotiations.
Well, how much is going to pay parity?
So
you can't say.
Pardon?
You can't say?
So at the moment, we are still going through the final negotiations and what all those figures will look like.
So the answer that I did get was that there's a $3.9 billion commitment to the Commonwealth. The bulk of that is rolling over existing commitments. There is an $800 million of additional funding, of which $500 million is actually going to frontline services. So what is the discrepancy between the $500 million going to frontline services over 5 years? So it's $100 million a year over 5 years. What is the other $300 million going towards?
So, Senator, the $3.9 billion just is made up of. So under the National Legal Assistance Partnership at the moment, which is around about $2.4 billion, there is baseline funding, and then there's a number of streams of funding, all of which are scheduled to come to an end on the 30th of June next year. And so those, as well as the baseline funding, all of those will be continued into the next agreement. And and then that next agreement also provides for ongoing funding, so beyond the 5 years. So all of that will become effectively new baseline.
The sector would have gone into open revolt had you pulled any of the existing funding away. So you're retaining the existing funding and making sure that existing funding continues over. But that's not what I'm asking you about. I'm asking you about the $800 million. You say there's $800 million of additional funding over the next, I assume it's over the next 5 years. You say $500 million of that is going to funding frontline services. What's the other $300 million?
So just to come to that, Senator, so then there is effectively those two amounts that you referenced. So the 500, which is focused on frontline, and then the $300 million is where the pay parity and the better indexation amounts sit. So, of course, in reality, they go to frontline service delivery as well, because it is supporting staff in legal assistance services. So The reason it's different is because that the indexation is the. This is where it starts getting a little bit complicated, but it is effectively additional indexation on top of that 3.1 billion.
This is because the NLAP indexation was radically below inflation over the last 3 years.
It was set in 2020 and didn't increase.
Yes, it was set in 2020 with the assumptions that inflation would go in one direction, and then we had a variety of global shocks and inflation shot well above where the indexation was. And the end result was, for the last 3 years, the indexation under NLAP has been radically less than inflation and seen a substantial reduction in the real funding that frontline services have had over the last 3 years. That we agree on that, don't we?
So, Senator, I agree that the indexation has been static over that time.
The indexation has been well below inflation.
Call in a second, Senator.
The indexation has been well below inflation, and the real value of the funds going to the sector from the Commonwealth has fallen dramatically as a result of that gap between indexation and inflation. Do you have an assessment of what that gap is? The reduction in real funding was?
I don't, Attorney.
And so in part the indexation...
Senator Shoebridge, I will have to share the call. We will come back to you.
Can I just finish this one?
Of course.
The indexation is to try and plug a small part of that gap that happened over the last 3 years. And the pay parity is so that Aboriginal legal services and community legal services stop losing every one of their solicitors because they're paying them so less even than legal aid. That's what those two things are about. They're just stemming the flow, aren't they?
Well, I wouldn't characterise it just as stemming the flow, but in terms of your description around pay parity, it certainly is intended to ensure that Aboriginal legal services and community legal centres can provide salaries that would prevent people from leaving them and moving into legal aid commissions.
Thanks, Senator. Sorry.
Answer, Senator. Just in terms of indexation, there was, of course, a budget measure this year for $44 million for this current financial year as well.
And so yes, and on notice you'll tell me which services got that.
The 44 million, yes. I think we probably...
You could do it on notice because the chair wants to move on.
Thank you. That's Senator